So, for those of you who are not aware, a lot of people are talking about optional mask wearing here in Victoria now as a result of our increased case numbers of COVID-19. And as with all things in this world, it's become politicized because could we just listen to the health advice and do what the experts say? No, of course not. It must be about our freedom somehow. The central thesis is if you are able to wear a mask in public in areas where you can't socially distance and there are lots of people around, like when you're in the supermarket, for example, it might be a good idea to wear a face mask. It's not really to protect you, per se, from other people with the virus as much as it is to protect other people from you if you have the virus and either A, aren't showing any symptoms yet but are still infectious, or B, are asymptomatic, which could be as many as 40% of people that have the virus don't necessarily show any symptoms but are still infectious. And even though every major medical body worldwide more or less agrees on the efficacy of face masks, including but not limited to Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, University of California, San Francisco, the Department of Health for New York, the Australian Government's Department of Health, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, who I would remind you, its central job is to control disease. They're all in agreement. Wearing masks, N95 masks, or cloth face coverings or surgical masks, these things do help prevent the disease in public. The thing that I find really frustrating about this is that it really has more to do with the country's culture than it does to do with the facts as to whether they adhere to these measures, especially regarding masks. For really individualistic cultures like the United States and to a lesser degree Australia, asking people to wear masks is an impingement on their freedom that we can't possibly acquiesce to. My rights. In cultures where it's more about the group and that have more of a sort of a communal ethic, particularly Asian cultures, South Korea, China, it's fairly normal to wear a mask because, like, if I could do something that might benefit my fellow man, like, of course, I'll do that. Why wouldn't I? You know, I reckon the Germans are going, yeah, if it's possible to help other people by wearing a mask, I would wear a mask. Why wouldn't I? Terrible German accent. Is it still racist? Is it racist to do a German accent now? But because it's the internet age, you will have people that put together videos on all sides of a topic, regardless of the veracity of the claims inside them. The problem with this isn't so much that there is misinformation being put out there, as much as it is the amplifying of this misinformation that causes it to spread, pun intended, virally. And the thing that really shits me about this is that a lot of the good information doesn't have really high production value, and people, for whatever reason, seem to equate production value with trustworthiness. Ray Dalio, founder of very famous hedge fund, Bridgewater Capital, in his book Principles, talks about believability-weighted people. There are certain people whose opinions you should trust on things. Should we listen to random asshole on the internet who was too conservative for Fox News but just right for Russia Today, former sports journalist? Or should we trust Dr. Norman Swan, who is a physician and health journalist with many years in the field? Well, Ray Dalio would say you trust the believability-weighted person. The person who has more expertise in the area is more likely to be correct about matters pertaining to that subject matter expertise, i.e. trust experts. But we're living in this weird, like, pseudo-conservative ideology world where, like, I guess facts are debatable, and my opinion as some fucking random lotioned bronze-tanned guy on the internet is just as valuable as an expert's, and that's just plain wrong. You know, by the way, when something's called, like, truth in media, or, like, the real truth, or the fact check behind the real truth, the media's lying to you, like, anything that starts off with that, you know, to be a little bit, you know, like, slightly dubious of. But the central point of Ben Swan's video is he quotes a bunch of studies and the science on masks isn't in, and in fact, they might contribute to you getting even more of an infection. And the problem with that is that I went and looked at the study, and what the study says was comparing N95 masks to surgical masks there being no substantive difference between the two. It didn't say that there was no difference between wearing an N95 mask and nothing, as I guess he conveniently forgets to mention. But I think this is precisely the point, because anyone can just get screen grabs of science and data and studies and randomized controlled tests.
Randomized controlled tests. Randomized controlled tests. The randomized controlled test.
Trials, pretty sure they're randomized controlled trials, and make it look scientific. They can cherry pick exactly which studies they want to look at. They can not talk about the p-value. They can support whatever hypotheses they want and put it forward in a video. And because it's got slick production values, it seems legit. But the problem is, this guy's a former sports journalist. He doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about. When relating to matters of health journalism, it makes sense to look to a reporter, a health reporter, ideally someone who's already a physician, like Dr. Norman Swan, whose CoronaCast podcast is excellent, by the way. I would recommend people download it and listen to it. Because they understand how to read the plurality of the evidence. They understand how to read studies. They understand when something might be statistically significant or not. And then they understand how to communicate that accurately to an audience. Science is not a handful of studies that you picked that prove your point. Science is the plurality of all the evidence over time, which is replicatable. Any study can be funded by someone unsavory, or could have the results be biased, or could have flaws in the methodology. It needs to be replicated in order to be proven whether it's viable or not. And yet you look at the Brit, Dr. John Campbell, who has a doctorate, who's worked for 40 years, I believe, in emergency rooms as a qualified nurse, has a really comprehensive health background, and you look at his production values, and even though he's smart and accurate, it kind of looks a bit shabby.
Are not infected. These were healthy. So these were infected with COVID-19, because hamsters can get it as well, apparently. So they were infected. These ones weren't. So the fan, when it was blowing that way, so it wasn't that the individual hamsters had masks on. Of course not. That would be silly. The cage was masked.
He hasn't got the blonde tips and the brown hair and the good lighting in the background. He doesn't have any of that stuff because he's just a guy trying to communicate the health science. There's no monetary value, I guess, in not being a contrarian asshole and agreeing with the CDC. Which isn't to say that any of these institutions are perfect. No institution is perfect. They should all be held to account. They should all be accountable for what they say. And sometimes they get things wrong. But when the plurality of the scientific evidence and all of these institutions are in agreement that covering your face does something to slow down the spread of COVID-19, when people's lives are at stake, you might do well to listen to them, even if they're not sexy looking. In the initial days of the pandemic, the advice was to not wear masks. Now, if that's because the viral load in Australian communities was pretty small at that time, or whether it was because the masks needed to be preserved for frontline health workers. But now that we know more, now that we know better, we can advise people to wear masks. You can put together cloth masks yourself, and it will make a substantial difference to the spread. Now, no one's going to strap you down and hold you to a chair and make you wear a mask. But like, if it helps other people, why wouldn't you? It's quite literally the least you can do as a citizen is when you're in a crowded place and you can't socially distance is whack on a mask. It costs next to nothing, it's easy to do, and doesn't impinge on your freedoms whatsoever. Fuck, it's not like we're asking you to go off to war and fight the, impending threat of Nazism. Like, it's a pretty small fucking sacrifice. Even just on the off chance that you help someone else. Isn't it worth it for such a minor inconvenience? I think there was also an aspect too early on where they were worried that it might create a moral hazard. If people are wearing masks, they might have a false sense of security that they can go and behave in ways that are dangerous in terms of spreading the coronavirus. If anything, now I'm editorializing here, that doesn't seem to be true. When I was at the shops the other day and I was wearing a mask, what I saw was people working at the supermarket being grateful that they were smiling and they welcomed me. They could see it was a cue that I take your safety seriously. And even if I don't have the coronavirus, and I never have, because how could I have been locked away in a vault for since the middle of March, it sends a signal to people that we're not living in normal times. Things are different. We have to be extra careful. And I think people appreciate it when you show that you give a shit about whether they live or die as a result of you. Anyway, I know that's super long and ranty, but I just needed to get it out. It was all pent up inside me, just tossing and turning. And if you see misinformation out there, kindly counter it with correct information from verified sources. I would love to hear what you guys think, as long as we're not arguing about the established science of mask wearing or any other conspiracy theories that you'd like to bring to mind. Oh, and actually, I'd like to finish on this part of Joe Rogan podcast with Bill Burr, where he has the more or less definitive word on whether or not people should wear masks.
You want people to walk down the street with a mask on?
Let's not start this, Joe.
Do you, though?
Let's not start this. Okay.
Let's start it.
I don't want to start this bullshit. I'm not going to sit here with no medical degree, listening to you with no medical degree, with an American flag behind you, smoking a cigar, acting like we know what's up better than the CDC. All I do is I watch the news once every 2 weeks. I'm like, mask or no mask? Still mask? All right, mask. That's all I give a fuck about.
And that was the only microphone I had nearby to drop. Thanks for watching, guys. Love your faces. See you in the next episode. Peace!